So let's start talking about the anatomy of the saw. The most important part, obviously, is the blade area. So when we're talking about the blade area, we're talking about basically everything in here. So we've got, obviously, the main blade, which is a 12-inch blade. We have a riving knife, scoring blade, and we have the blade plate, which is this black insert here. Now, the most important part of this assembly is the riving knife. The riving knife is your primary safety device on the table saw. It's what prevents material from passing over the blade at the back. It prevents material from pinching onto the blade. We don't really have any situation where you'd be using the saw and not running it with a riving knife installed. The Australian standard for riving knives is no lower than 13 millimeters below the top tooth of the blade, and no further than 3 to 13 millimeters between the blade and the knife itself. So long as the riving knife is positioned there and in line with the blade, it's good. So we have the main blade here, and we have the scribing blade here. The scribing blade, as we've discussed previously, rotates in the opposite direction to the main blade. Let's talk about the scoring blade on this saw for a little bit. So the scoring blade is this little blade in the front that runs in the counter rotation to the main blade. There's 3 holes in the table surface here. These 2 are for tuning the scribing blade to make sure that it is angled in line with the main blade, and really for most users you never need to touch it. This one here is an Allen key that lets you raise and lower the scribing blade. This is the one that you'll be interacting with, and it's only accessible when the blade's in a 90-degree position. So what's the scribing blade for? A scribing blade is for cutting melamines or laminate materials like this. So what happens is the scribing blade will come up and it will make a cut this way into the bottom laminate of the material, which means that when the main blade comes in and cuts through, it will come through the top surface, make a clean cut on the top laminate, and then it won't chip out the bottom laminate because it's already been cut. So it's not pulling through from the behind and like tearing out that laminate, so you get a nice clean edge on both sides of your board. That's what the scoring blade's for, and unless you're using a laminate, you don't need it for any other material. With the scribing blade, the mechanism is basically just a screw and a bolt that raises a lever. So as you're lowering the blade, sometimes it's necessary to just push on the arbor to make sure the blade's fully below the surface. When raising the blade, you really only need to have it as high as the laminate that you're cutting. So typically that means something like 0.1 to 0.5 of a mil above the surface of the table. We have a depth gauge that helps you set that. One of the things that we see people do a lot of the time that's really dangerous, and we try and just be very clear that this is an important safety rule with this saw, is people will often set up their cut before they've turned the saw on, and they'll place their material down and they'll place it here. And this is covering the scribing blade, but it's pre the main blade. And that's actually really dangerous because the scribing blade, because it rotates in the opposite direction, will, if it's just a little bit high, pull that thing forward into the main blade, bad things will happen. So whenever you're setting up your material and whenever you're setting up for a cut, you always start before the blade plate, which is this black insert here. As long as you're before the blade plate, you are before the blade assembly, and that's perfectly safe. So all your cuts need to start back here. So here we have the handle for the sliding table, stop or the lock for the sliding table, which you need to pull out, rotate 90 degrees to keep it open, and then you can move the slide, and then you can pull it out and rotate it back for it to lock in. We have the sliding table itself. We have the sliding table extension, which is the white arm frame that comes out from the sliding table. The sliding table fence. The sliding table fence has 2 stops that you can move around on it and flip on and off. And it has a clamp, which is useful for holding down the corner of large material. Locks for the extension on the sliding table, which hold the extension in place. Underneath the table, you'll find both the main lock and the angle lock that holds the fence in place. Sometimes it can be necessary to move this extension table that we have on the slide. So what you do is you've got these two handles here and you just loosen them off. And then you can move this back and forth, and then you can tighten it up again. These are ratcheting, so if you want to move them, you pull them out and they spin freely, you put them in and they bite and tighten, and then if you want to move it out and put it out, it's like that. This under here can sometimes limit the motion of the slide of the entire table, because this only has so much travel, and so the slide can sometimes, if the extension is at the end of the table on either direction, it can stop you going all the way forward or all the way back. And sometimes if you have it in the wrong position, it can prevent you getting to the blade to change it, or it can prevent you from moving the slide through the full range of motion while you're making a cut. So sometimes you need to adjust where this extension sits on the main aluminium slide. Let's talk about the clamp that you'll find on our sliding table fence for a moment. So if we look at this clamp here, what a lot of newbies do with this is they'll set their material up, they'll bring the material down with the clamp and lock it off, and then they'll stand back and they'll have their hands well back away from the material, and they're not even holding onto it themselves because they're believing that the clamp is doing the job for them. It's not for that. The clamp is not for holding down your material so that you don't have to. You still have to manually, hold it down yourself. What the clamp is for is when you're cutting very large pieces of material, like a full sheet of plywood, it's quite difficult sometimes to keep the front edge down. So the clamp is just an extra hand there so that when you're too far away to hold it yourself, this clamp comes in handy for holding down that leading edge so that when you make the cut, it comes through correctly. On the sliding table fence here, we have two sliding table fence stops, which is a lot to say, but I don't have a better name for them. What these are really great for is they're basically stops that you can move on and off as you make cuts. Typically, if you're squaring up material into a rectangle, for example, for the laser cutter, you might want a piece of material that is 500 by 700. So you would set these up to 500 and 700. So right here, I'm going to set this up to 500 just there, tighten that down, and then this one here, set it to 700, like that, and set that one down. So what I can do now is I can put my piece of material in, I can make my 700 cut on this side of the blade, and then swap over, do my 500 cut on this side of the blade, and they're useful just for that. These are also, because we consider them part of the process of doing repeated cuts, because all you're really doing is flipping them on and off, they're the only action that we're happy for you to do while the saw is running, apart from just moving your material back for another cut. So go for it. There's a scale on this sliding table fence. Like, this thing moves back and forth, so how do you make it accurate? The way you make it accurate is we've made a custom block here that is the correct size. And what happens is if you get this block and you bring it right up to the edge of the sliding table itself, so that it's right in line with that edge, then this scale here is accurate to within about 1 millimeter. So how do you know that when you're setting this fence up that it's actually square and you're going to get a reasonable cut? The answer is that you don't. If you really care about how square something's going to be, you need to basically set it up with a 5-cut method, which is outside the scope of this course, and just tune the saw in. But for most reasonable levels of accuracy, what we have here is a stop that you can rotate in and out of place. And if you bring it back onto that stop, this is 90 degrees to the blade. If you need to do something else or something weird, you can flip it out of the way and set up whatever other thing that you need to do.